book's platform is Tragedy and the Triumph of the Human Spirit, with Dr. Joe Chuman. Dr. Chuman has been the leader of the Ethical Society of Bergen County, New Jersey, since 1974, and since 2008 has served as part-time leader here at the New York Society for Ethical Culture. As an activist, Dr. Chuman has worked on behalf of human rights, civil liberties, and opposition to the death penalty, as well as many other progressive causes. He founded the Northern New Jersey group of Amnesty International in 1974 and currently serves as president of the Bergen County Sanctuary for Asylum Seekers, founded by the Ethical Culture Society of Bergen County. This coalition of religious and human rights organizations provides services for asylum seekers who are released from federal detention. As a writer and educator, that was as an activist and community organizer. As a writer and educator, Dr. Chuman teaches human rights at the graduate level at Columbia University and has taught at the United Nations University for Peace in San Jose, Costa Rica. He has published numerous articles in the Record of Bergen County, New Jersey. Published articles in the New York Times, The Humanist, Free Inquiry, Humanistic Judaism, and other periodicals. He has had articles published on ethical culture and religion in several encyclopedias. That's very important for our legacy to be known. Dr. Chuman.
Thank you so very much, Cheryl. It's really great being back here. Boy, the older you get, the quicker time passes. It feels like just yesterday, but it was almost a month ago I was here. As Cheryl mentioned, I'm a part-time leader of the New York Society, and I like to joke with Cheryl that she is the member of the New York Society whom I encounter most here when I'm here. And fortunate I am, because Cheryl, I think, is a beautiful exemplar of a person who is eminently kind and very intelligent at the same time. A beautiful combination. And fortunate, to have her as a member, she really exemplifies, I think, the best of what we're about. David had mentioned that Bob Dylan, in his view, is a poet before he's a musician. And I got to tell you, you have good friends in Stockholm who thought the same thing and gave him the Nobel Prize for Literature, which really, for us baby boomers, just blew us away. I mean, just can't get over it. Just a moment of celebration. So thank you very much. I want to lay off the politics this morning and talk about a topic that deals with the human condition and, in my view, the nature of humanism, our humanistic philosophy in a deeper sense. And so my talk this morning is really a combination of philosophy and my personal experience. What I want to do is share with you something which is actually rather impressionistic. The ideas I seek to impart, I have to say, are very much my own, and I don't claim at all to have any final truths. And the views that I'll put forward, I have to be very emphatic about this, need not be yours. But my hope is that you can take away from my address what strikes you as compelling and useful, and perhaps gently push aside my observations with which you disagree. We all, of course, have our own individual philosophies of life, our own viewpoints and opinions that emerge out of our own life experiences. Therefore, it's inevitable that in our distinctiveness, we will find points of disagreement with others, even as our opinions, on the other hand, overlap in other areas. But I think it's through engagement with the opinions of others that we each personally grow and enrich ourselves. So I want to begin with a brief discussion of humanism, or at least one variant of it. My discussion here will serve, I should say, as a foil against which I want to present my own thoughts. Humanism, in the broadest sense, can be understood as a celebration of life. In this regard, it perhaps contrasts with the historical religions. The religions, especially the Western ones, are centered on God. Humanism places human beings and their flourishing at the center of our concerns. Whereas Christianity, which of course has had a very powerful role in shaping the values of the West, sees the human being as primarily sinful and as a fallen creature, humanism, by contrast, celebrates the joy of human existence and affirms the goodness and beauty of man. Whereas the monotheist religions proclaim that the human being is dependent on the Creator and thereby lacks the ability to improve this world independent of divine assistance, humanism says that human beings have all they need to fashion all the resources they need to fashion a better world, drawing solely on their own powers, abilities, intelligence, and the will to do so. Whereas the religions assert that our meaning in life comes from the cosmic realm, and we all live out a divine assignment, so to speak, humanism proclaims that we boldly create our own sense of meaning in life out of our experiences. Whereas the monotheistic faiths teach that it is our duty to worship and give deference to the power and glory of God, humanism asserts that our highest purpose in life is to develop our human potentialities, our emotional, intellectual, and physical potentials to the greatest degree possible. For the humanist, each of us is like a modern Prometheus who summons our courage and our strength of will to forge our own direction in life, and carve out our own destinies. The life we live is in great measure, therefore, the life we create. There is something admittedly very exhilarating, adventuresome, and maybe even heroic in this view of life. Humanism, again, celebrates life. It teaches us to see life through a lens that filters out the bad stuff in order to emphasize the beautiful, the joyous, and the happy things that life has to offer. For the humanist of this strife, life is prevailingly good, if not bountiful. And what we need do is better dispense ourselves to see the good and affirm what conduces towards our happiness. For humanism of this variety, optimism, not pessimism, is the preferred outlook. The humanist does not fret about his or her condition, does not cry in his pillow, does not dwell in his sadness, but always looks ahead to find the silver lining that lies behind the cloud. If there are misfortunes in life, and they are essentially challenges, says the humanist, to be grappled with and overcome. We assess the problem, hopefully resolve it, dispense with it, and then move on. The humanist looks ahead and does not look back. The disposition and life philosophy of the humanist is not dour or sullen, but primarily upbeat and cheery. In short, the humanist raises his gaze to the sun and declares life good. Here I gotta get personal. When I discovered humanism in my late teenage years, this was my understanding of humanism. But friends, admittedly, I have to confess, it no longer is. I have long come to the position that this interpretation of humanism and the outlook that it describes is superficial, one-dimensional, naive, and does not do justice to the complexity, depth, and ambiguities of life as we confront them. It seems to me also, to be very frank, to be somewhat adolescent. Often the adolescent confronts his or her problems with exuberance and with an inflated sense of his or her own power and ability. Maybe my current take on life is primarily a matter of my temperament, but it is a temperament that has been forged and shaped by more than half a century of lived experience and probing reflection on that experience. It is my view that an aspect of maturity is coming to recognize that life is indeed very complex and multi-tiered, and there is in fact a great deal of ambiguity in life. I need to explain what I mean. I believe that we all wear social masks. When in the company of others, and especially when we're out in public, we all strive to present our best selves, and there's nothing wrong with this. Not only does it enable us to preserve our individual self-esteem, but I conclude that it's also socially necessary. If we were, by contrast, to let it, quote, all hang out, so to speak, social relations would become so fraught, so jagged and edgy and problematic that society could not function, and certainly could not function smoothly. We strive to put on our best selves in order to feel better about ourselves and to grease the wheels of social relations. But the way in which we present ourselves, this outer manifestation of our personalities, is not, friends, what we see when we peer beneath the surface and look behind the mask. As the leader of a congregation now for more than 4 decades, I have been admittedly in a very privileged position to get to know the lives of many people behind the personalities they publicly present. And you know, when you look beneath the surface, you most often find a reality that is very different. I conclude that very fortunate and rare indeed is the family that goes untouched by great tragedy. I am not referring to temporary setbacks or misfortunes, such as perhaps losing one's job, or the slights that one receives from the insensitivity of others, friends and strangers alike. What I'm referring to are deep-seated, long-lasting, if not chronic problems, pains and burdens, which are so consuming that they serve often as the defining dynamics of one's life, and loom over us in such a way as to often sap life of sustained joys. I'm thinking of those people, and I've known, each one of these are examples I've known. I'm thinking of those people who suffer from chronic physical pain and debilitating disabilities and diseases. And nothing focuses the mind and narrows one's horizons as does being in great pain. And I should say, I'll use myself as an example. Fortunately, I don't suffer from chronic pain, but there was a period where I had, maybe some of you have experienced this, I had a pinched nerve, okay? There's been other arthritic deterioration, but I had a pinched nerve, and I tell you, the pain was so excruciating. I could think of nothing else, and it became frightening when my own thought processes began to erode. So great was the pain. I can't begin to imagine what it must be like to suffer this throughout one's life. It was just, pain narrows your cognitive horizons like nothing else. I'm thinking of the person also who receives a difficult cancer diagnosis, which will commit her to ongoing and arduous treatments for the rest of her life, and in which the odds are severely stacked against her. I'm thinking of the parents of disabled children, or children who are schizophrenic, and whose parents are fated to be their children's custodians well into their adulthood and for the rest of their own lives. I'm thinking of the parents of children who are lost to chronic addictions and criminality. I am thinking of those parents who suffer inexpugnable anguish at the death of their own children, and those people, and it is most of us, of course, who endure the bereavement at the loss of an intimate partner. These are pains and misfortunes that in great measure shape our lives, if not define us, they certainly change us. In many cases, they become part of who we are, and in some sense, those who experience them never get over them. And what compounds the suffering is that it goes on for the most part in private, which forces those enduring the tragedy to, at least to some degree, live a double life. Namely, they are fated to confront their challenges and woes in private, while presenting a very different face, a more positive face, to the outside world. So there's a type of secondary burden of living, in effect, what I would call a double life. My point again is that, and this is the important thing, my point again is that these are not rare occurrences, nor are they temporary or minor setbacks to be swept under the rug. And if we refuse to deny them, and if we take them seriously, and we cumulatively add them up one by one by one by one, I think inferentially it is not wrong to come to the conclusion that tragedy is in fact a mainstay of the human condition. And speaking personally, it is because I take tragedy seriously that I have long ago abandoned a sunny or cheery view of the human condition. We can deny it, I think, if we wish. We can deny it if we wish. But to do so, I believe, is to abandon one's intellectual integrity and fail to embrace the reality of the human condition as it is. And this is something I will not and cannot do. Recognizing, of course, and here I've got to be very clear, recognizing, of course, that others might see the world and the human condition differently, okay? But I feel the way I do in great measure because my humanism, as I understand it, demands it. But tragedy is more than just bad things happening to us. It is more than the pain, suffering, and misfortune. And I want to speak about tragedy in a fuller and richer way. And so we can begin by asking the question, what is tragedy? The variant of humanism that I cited earlier puts a premium, among other things, on the ability of human beings to forge their own destinies, both as individuals and collectively as a species. The acceptance of tragedy, as I understand it, on the other hand, requires that this view of human capacities be highly qualified. What I mean is that the realization of tragedy starts with the recognition and acceptance that many things that happen to us and many things that befall us in life are simply things for which we are not responsible, and are not our fault and are beyond our control. Bad things happen to us, and they often come undeserved and unbidden. We did not plan for them, we did not want them, they just happened to us. There are many who believe that all things happen for a reason, or some religions teach that all things, no matter how awful, will over time turn out for some good purpose, which is beyond our ken. In my view, these are theological rationalizations that at bottom lack the courage to accept that there is real tragedy in life, and that all problems we are forced to confront do not admit to solutions or even resolutions. Life, I believe, friends, is serious business, and it is often unfair, and it is often very hard. The tragic view starts from the understanding that we human beings are finite and limited creatures, and we live in a reality that is much larger than we are. It starts with the realization, and this is my view, that our reason indeed is a most powerful and admirable tool and attribute that we possess, but there are events which impinge on our lives that extend beyond our reason to grasp or understand. We use our reason to resolve problems and plan for a future in which we can gain greater security and perhaps even happiness. But often, despite our best and most sincere efforts, despite the application of our greatest care and intelligence and the purest of intentions, things often turn out badly for us. There's a very terse expression in Yiddish that captures this reality very well, to the effect that man tracht und Gott lacht, which means in simplest terms, man plans and God laughs. Okay, a lot of truth in that, I believe. I need to be clear. The tragic view does not suggest that things always turn out badly. They don't. Or that they must. They don't have to. Though in the final analysis, we know that death looms over all of us. But what the tragic view entails is not that tragedy is inevitable, but that tragic endings are forever a possibility. It was the Greek historian Herodotus who said, this was a sort of a Greek cliche, a Greek view, he said, count no man happy until his last day. Okay? You never know what's going to befall you. What the tragic view entails, therefore, is a sober and mature sense of humility in the face of the complexity of life. It is recognition again that there are things that we cannot control despite our best efforts. And there are several affirmative conclusions that follow from this perspective. On the one hand, the realization that we cannot be completely certain that everything we plan for will turn out well could and should lead us to a more prudent and mindful state of being in how we do set our plans in order for us to stand the best chance to ward off the possibilities that bad things will happen. If by contrast we were certain that all things we planned for would turn out exactly as we expect, this confidence in our own powers might quickly lead to recklessness and a sense of our own omnipotence, which is again, I think, a characteristic of adolescence. And secondly, let it be emphasized very strongly that the acceptance of tragedy as part of the human condition does not require that we accept a depressed, gloomy, or melancholy view of life. Rather, the acceptance that we live within a larger reality and things happen to us that often seem arbitrary can indeed inspire us to an even more profound appreciation of happiness and bliss, in that they can come upon us, these good things can come upon us, not as a result of planning, but as a result of serendipity, sort of like a gift we receive without asking for it. The joy we directly receive and the joy we receive from witnessing the joy of others, the laughter of children, the effulgence of young romance, the kindness we receive from others we care about and who care about us. These remain joys, and maybe become even more joyous when we experience them against the background that they might not have been and did not have to be. But there remain other ways of understanding tragedy. Philosophers who have reflected on the tragic dimension, from Aristotle on down, have identified tragedy as emerging out of the inescapable reality that humanity occupies a middle state, so to speak. For Aristotle, we exist halfway between the gods and the beasts. The gods, we can assume, have no needs and therefore enjoy an existence of unqualified happiness. The beasts, on the other hand, lack for the most part consciousness and self-reflection, and therefore for the most part are at one with nature. The animals that live in the woods behind my house, for example, the deer, the raccoons, the squirrels, the birds, the groundhogs, yes, and the occasional coyote, no doubt suffer fear in the moment when fleeing predators, or experience the pain of hunger, or perhaps experience even a warm sense of security when they bundle up in their refuge. But with a few exceptions, animals probably lack reflective self-consciousness, and therefore the anxiety and anticipatory fear that comes with being a conscious being such as we are. We can assume that they don't worry about hurting their mother's feelings, experiencing jealousy at the achievement of their peers, or more to the point, grow anxious and fearful at the contemplation of their own annihilation and their utter disappearance. But we reflective beings do, and we can exquisitely feel the pain which comes with consciousness and self-consciousness, all of which plays into the tragic dimension of the human condition. Gods and beasts fit perfectly into their environments, but we human beings are like the pieces of a jigsaw puzzle that just don't quite fit. And because of this, life becomes problematic, anxiety-inducing, often edgy, and this too augments the happenstance of tragedy. For Aristotle, the middle state was the province of social beings and the triumphs and tragedies of our social lives. Tragedy often occurs, Aristotle wrote, when people possess a flaw in their own characters of which they are unaware, and this flaw causes them to unwittingly make bad and often catastrophic choices. And often this flaw, so Aristotle and other Greeks opined, was hubris. That is the act of going too far, as when man strives to act as a god, which he is not. Much of the drama of the great tragedians, Aeschylus, Euripides, and most of all Sophocles, is built around this dynamic of the unwitting fatal flaw, usually the flaw being hubris. Our own Felix Adler, the founder of ethical culture, was exquisitely aware of this middle state that human beings occupy, and it became a centerpiece of his own ethical philosophy, although it had a different content than what Aristotle proposed. Adler stated explicitly that he said very explicitly that he embraced the tragic view of life, which he saw as illuminating and even a heroic dimension in which people strive very hard, yet often fail in their strivings through no fault of their own. In Adler's take on the human condition, we are caught again in the middle. We are caught between our ideals on the one hand and life as we actually experience it in the here and now. In his view, we are the types of creatures who live in the here and now with all its ups and downs, and yet because of our imagination, our cognitive capacities, we can project and do project a condition of perfection. We suffer illness and we can imagine an ideal world without disease. Much of humanity suffers from poverty and hunger, but we can project a world in which no one is poor or hungry. We see degradation, injustice, and oppression all around us, and yet we can frame in our minds an ideal world without degradation, injustice, and oppression, in which the dignity of women, men, and children will be reverenced and upheld. Furthermore, Adler believed that having framed our ideals, there is something in us that propels us, that compels us, that pushes us to want to move towards them and close the gap between the actual world we endure and the ideal realm of perfection. But since ideals remain ideal and perfection is not in the cards for us, Adler believed we therefore by necessity, and this is intrinsic in the human condition, we by necessity always fall short. We yearn for the perfect but remain imperfect. We yearn for the infinite but remain finite. And because we do, Adler concluded that there is built in the human condition an element of frustration. That was a centerpiece of his understanding of the human condition. Frustration that we human beings can never do ourselves out of. And it is this inescapable frustration that for Adler creates and describes the tragic dimension of the human condition. That's why he adopted the tragic view. He believed it was intrinsically built into the nature of the human condition, the types of creatures we are in reality as we are forced to confront it. But Adler drew one additional conclusion. In his view, this frustration did not necessarily lead to despondency or despair, but to something else. He opined that our inevitable failure and frustration in attaining the ideal actually inspires us to value the ideal even more. The fact that we have not conquered disease does not result in humanity quitting the desire to put an end to disease, but rather to continue the struggle towards finding cures for those maladies that plague us. The fact that we are far from achieving the ideal of justice does not crush the human learning to create a just society. The ideals burn brightly despite the failures we endure, and perhaps even more so. Just one footnote, Adler and Aristotle were not idiosyncratic. The great 20th century existentialists, and I'm thinking of the Spanish thinker Unamuno, and I'm thinking of the great humanist Albert Camus, also adopted the tragic view. I mean, one of Camus' most famous essays was called The Myth of Sisyphus. Do you recall, right? He sort of opined on the character of Sisyphus, who's one of the classic Greek sufferers, and his punishment is he's in Hades, he's in hell, and his punishment is to push a heavy boulder up a hill, only to find that when he succeeded in pushing the boulder up the hill, it inevitably falls back down again for him to repeat the task. And as far as we know, poor Sisyphus is still at it, okay? Now, that's a great comment on the human condition, right? But in effect, Camus did not conclude that Sisyphus therefore was depressed about his wherewithal. In fact, he says at the very end of this essay, we have to declare Sisyphus happy, because in effect, his happiness comes out of the realization of the struggle that he is engaged in and what he's up against. So he, in some sense, Sisyphus, paradoxically, is the happiest of all people, in effect, struggling within the context of, the circumstance in which he is fated to be. Which brings me to my conclusion. My title is Tragedy and the Triumph of the Human Spirit. And so I ask the question, where do we find the greatness in human beings? And where do we find the greatness in the human spirit? If we are searching for triumph, I have two responses. I have proposed two variants of humanism. The first I identified with a one-dimensional understanding of the human condition, in which problems present themselves to us, we deal with them matter-of-factly, and then move on. Let's call this humanism A. Okay, that's humanism A. And I would never, and I've got to be very clear, I would never gainsay that there is much to triumphantly celebrate in this view of life. There is much to celebrate in those circumstances in which a person achieves victory and triumph over the challenges that confront her or him, and often against very great odds. The student who studies hard and wins their degree. The athlete, the performer, the artist who sets high goals and applies herself with all her resources and achieves her goals or wins the race. The person who does confront a very serious disease and disability and in fact overcomes it. Life presents us from morning till night with seemingly an infinite range and infinite examples of people, young and old, who aim high and endure all kinds of obstacles, physical, emotional, social, economic, legal, and so on, and persevere and indeed succeed and triumph. This is true. Life is problematic. From the time you take your first breath until you go to bed, we're constantly dealing with problems, and we overcome most of them, and that's a cause to celebrate the human condition. People triumph, and as such, achievements and victories are worthy, of course, of our joy and admiration. That's a very important part of life. All of us have experienced such accomplishments, such victories, and they bring with them moments of sweetness to life that we savor and which we richly and rightly deserve. But in my view, however good and worthy, essential and celebratory the manifest victory over challenges and adversities that confront us are, this ultimately is not where the triumph of the human spirit is to be found, I believe, in the deepest and most significant sense. I say this because I take seriously what I've been trying to convey, and that is that despite our most sincere and laborious efforts, we often find that we fail to achieve manifest triumph over the overwhelming challenges that life throws at us, and again for causes that extend beyond our own powers and for reasons that in no sense are our fault. There are challenges that are simply bigger than we are. This realization embraces what I would call humanism B, so to speak. And so, if ultimate triumph of the human spirit is not to be found, in our manifest victories over the adversities that life throws at us, where do we find it? My answer to that question is not theoretical. It's not theoretical, but again emerges from witnessing the lives of many people who have confronted what in practical terms are overwhelming challenges, pains, hardships, misfortunes, and a word, tragedies. And that greatness, and this is the payoff of my address, and that greatness, that triumph of the spirit, I believe, is manifested in the sheer persistence, the sheer doggedness, the sheer relentlessness and resilience, and the perseverance of men and women caught in overwhelming circumstances who simply refuse to give up, but persist in their struggle and often against the greatest odds strive to eke out some happiness from life, to forge on in search of a better day, or in some sense simply come to terms with what is a merciless fate. It is the person who, despite feeling that they lack the strength to continue, digs even deeper and scrapes out those personal resources they never thought they had to move on as best as they can. They may win or they may lose, but it is not the manifest victory, but in the very struggle itself that the triumph, the greatness of the human spirit, I believe, is to be found. It is in the renewal of life, in the face of suffering and death, that we encounter the triumph of the human spirit. One final word here in the name of community, especially this community, our community. If the background for the triumph of the human spirit, as I'm defining it, is the tragic reality that besets the human condition, then I conclude that there is a heroism in this view of life. But all too often, it is a quiet, unheralded, almost secret heroism that goes on in private. And to be sealed off from others when one is in pain, in fact, is to magnify one's suffering. And so here I think we all have our roles to play. I just love it, personally. I am delighted when I hear simple, very simple stories of people who go out of their way to spend time with a friend who is suffering from an incurable disease or disability, or by their simple presence brings the warmth of a human bond to someone who is bereaved. Such acts of kindness will not cure the disease or make the dead live again, but it does convey the message, and this is such an important message, the message that the person who is suffering is not alone. And this is, I contend, again, a very important message. Indeed, it is a simple but precious gift that we can readily bring to others. It is perhaps the culminating reality of the tragic view of life that we are here for a short while. But while we are here, I believe we have no higher calling than to be supportive to one another and bring kindness and sweetness to life, especially where a little sweetness may otherwise be found.